My special guest this morning is a professor of economics in the Political Economy Research Institute here at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. A new book, The Making of a Catastrophe, the disastrous economic fallout of the Covid-19 pandemic, was published by Aleph Books, and it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Professor Jayati, Ghosh, thank you so much for making the time and welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right, so what are the core ideas of the book and what do you consider to be the central argument?
I wrote this book, which is really about how COVID-19 impacted the Indian economy, because I wanted there to be a correct record. Increasingly, we find that governments tend to rewrite history, that they present even the recent past in exactly the way they want. They can suppress information. They can even suppress people's experiences. I wanted everyone to realize that what happened in India during the pandemic was actually a catastrophe. It was not just a health disaster. It was a catastrophe at every level, in terms of education, in terms of livelihood, in terms of people's rights. And this was not a catastrophe that was because of the disease. It was really because of the way the government responded and how the government used the medical emergency. So this is something that happened in other countries as well, but I think India is the extreme example, where the government used the fact of the pandemic to implement a very, very harsh lockdown that suited it politically, that enabled it to suppress dissent, and at the same time caused immense suffering, well beyond what could have been expected because of the health emergency. And this in turn has laid the basis for a very unequal recovery. So people feel that the Indian economy has recovered, that is in the rest of the world. Our GDP growth is up and the top 10% is doing very well. But most of the population is significantly worse off than they were compared to before the pandemic.
So your book begins with a discussion of the effects of the pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns on the global economy. What differences and similarities do you see between the way that the Indian government responded to the pandemic and the way that other governments in the rest of the world did? Are there any factors that make the Indian case particularly catastrophic, as you put it in the book?
I think the specificity of the Indian case is that there was a combination of extremely harsh lockdown measures and almost no social protection or compensation. So if you compare what has happened, let's say in the United States, first of all, there was no national level lockdown. It was in different states and different degrees of closure. Yes? Whereas in India, it was with 4 hours notice, a national lockdown like a military curfew, where people would be shot at if they went outside, where people were deprived of livelihood in 4 hours notice. Now remember, India is an economy with 95% informal workers. That is, workers who don't have legal protection, social protection. Half of the economy is self-employed. Many of them are small shopkeepers, small service providers, people working in agriculture. Many of them work in very small enterprises that are not even registered. Okay, so we have very informal workers who don't have any legal protection or any automatic social protection. And so when you declare a lockdown, you're basically saying that's it, you cannot earn any money, which means after a while you will starve if you don't actually earn. So we imposed a lockdown, first for 21 days, then another 2 weeks, another 3 weeks, finally for about 3 months. There was a national level lockdown. Now, you can imagine what this is doing to an economy where people don't have any other means of support. Unlike in the United States and Europe, where people got cash transfers, they got banks transfers, They got money from the government. The employers were giving some kind of money, furloughs and so on. None of this is available to most of the Indian workers, right? So you have a lockdown without social protection, and in an economy where most of the people are already poor. So you actually had workers on the verge of starvation. And the only major social protection that was provided is through the ration scheme. We have a food grain ration scheme. And so 5 kilograms per person was provided free of cost. But that's very little, right? Per month, it's very little, and also it doesn't cover any of your other expenses. But in addition, about 100 million poor people are excluded from that, because this is based on a list that was made more than a decade ago. Okay? So, in fact, you got starvation. We had the extraordinary phenomenon of about 150 migrant workers who come from different parts of the country and rural India to work in the cities, forced to walk back hundreds of miles. They had to walk back because they just could not survive in the urban areas. They couldn't pay rent, they couldn't buy food. They walked back to their villages, to their natal homes in extreme conditions. And of course, while they were walking, they were suffering because they're not legally supposed to be moving, right? There are no public trains, there are no public buses. All of that started about 2 months after the lockdown started. So they really had to suffer and walk hundreds of kilometers. There is lots of episodes of people dying on the way. It was the biggest movement of people that we have seen since the partition of India in 1947, when there was a massive dislocation of people. So you had this mass movement of migrants, enforced movement, because it's not that they wanted to, it's because they really had no other means of subsistence. And everything was left to state governments. So this is the other peculiarity of India, that we have a central government and we also have state governments. It's a federal system. The central government made all the decisions on the basis of what a National Disaster Management Act. They announced a lockdown. They didn't even tell the state governments that there was going to be this lockdown. They just announced it, and then the state governments have to implement it, and the state governments have to deal with the fallout. They have to manage the fact that there are people moving, there are people starving, there are people who don't have access to medical care, reproductive health. I mean, all kinds of disasters occurred because of a very strongly enforced lockdown. Now, this lockdown was enforced at a time when there were only about 500 cases in the whole country. So 1.3 billion people, 500 cases, that too basically in 4 cities. We could have controlled it locally. Even in China, the lockdown was only in Wuhan. It wasn't all over the country. Why do it all over the country? But it was done. And part of it was because at that time there were a bunch of social movements and dissenters objecting to some of the government policies. There was an attempt that the government had brought in to a legislation that was called the Citizenship Amendment Act. And it was basically effectively making Muslims second-class citizens. So there were widespread protests all over the country and in all the major cities. There were sit-ins. And those sit-ins had been continuing for months. And the government really didn't know how to handle it. Now you had the perfect excuse. You say there's a pandemic. It's a health hazard. Everybody has to leave. And everybody left because of the health hazard. So they used this pandemic and the lockdown to clear the streets of protesters, to get rid of all the dissent, and to enforce a really brutal kind of curfew on people without recognizing what it meant for their livelihoods.
So there are people that think that your assessment of the response of the Indian government might have been too harsh. Do you think that the Indian government had the capacity to respond to the disastrous effects of the pandemic? And if so, what could have been done better in order to combat the disastrous effects that you refer to in the book?
Yes. I think there were 3 things that the government could have done differently. I think, first of all, you didn't have to do a national lockdown. You could have done local lockdowns depending on the severity of the cases, and then enforced more of the tracing and following up of managing it, the way that they did it afterwards. Because remember, this lockdown lasted in the first phase. But in India, we had 3 phases. And the second phase was even worse. It was a year later. But at that time, there was no lockdown. So they did a lockdown when you didn't need to. That was number one, very big mistake. And it was a lockdown that didn't take into account the informality of work, the need for people to get livelihood, and so on, right? At the same time, they didn't take the state governments into confidence. They didn't discuss it at all with them. They didn't have a meeting and saying, okay, how shall we do this? Who's going to handle what? Should we close all the flights? Should we close all the trains? Should we close all the buses? They just announced it and said, no more interstate movement, no more trains, no more buses. And they didn't actually ensure that the state governments could manage the situation. So the second thing was that they didn't behave in a federal way. They were very centralized. And then the third thing they did wrong is that, you know this will have terrible effects on the economy, right? We know that in the rich countries, they spent vast amounts to help the economy recover. It's true that in our countries, we don't have the same fiscal capacity. But the Indian government and the Mexican government are the 2 governments that spent the least. You know, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Thailand, every government spent more. In India, we spent hardly anything more. And we could have. We had the capacity to spend more. You know, we claim we are one of the major economies of the world now. So we could have actually spent more for our people. The fact that we didn't, it's not just that it dramatically affected people and their health and their nutrition and their livelihood and all of that. It has also meant that the recovery after that is very unequal.
What was the situation like right before the COVID-19 pandemic with regards to the healthcare sector? Because I would want to believe that if the government was prepared enough for any external shock, the process and the transition to recover from the effects of the pandemic would have been made easier.
So once again, this is the problem, that even before the pandemic, both the Indian economy and the society, they were not in good shape. Okay, the Indian expenditure on health has been one of the lowest in the world in terms of government spending. Total government spending on health, that is from the central and state governments put together, it's only 1% of GDP, which is really low. I mean, in most countries of our per capita income level, it's about 3 to 4%. So there's very little public spending on health, which means most of the health burden is borne by families, by individuals, by households. And so the out-of-pocket expenditure, that is, what you just pay at the time of a health emergency, is 75% of total health spending, which is a very bad ratio in international terms, worse than Bangladesh, much worse than Sri Lanka, much worse than other similar countries. So we were already in bad shape. The other part of our health spending is that very little of it goes into the formal health structure, and a lot of it is based on what you could call barefoot doctors, barefoot nurses. There's a kind of parallel scheme, with volunteer workers, we call them. We call them volunteer workers because we don't pay the minimum wage. And mostly they are women, they're local women with a minimum level of education, just grade 5 and above. And you hire them to do you give them a little bit of training and you hire them to do basic things, looking after pregnant and lactating mothers and infant children, providing basic medicine, providing injections, doing periodic health checkups. All the basic things that should be done by a regular health service are being done by these volunteer workers who are unpaid, underpaid, overworked. And so obviously you're not getting the best possible. We had a very poorly functioning health system. However, because it's a federal system, some state governments are much better than others. So in general, the southern states have always invested more in health and in education. It's a long and complicated reason, but in general that's the case. So Kerala, for example, which is a relatively small state in the south, it has very good health indicators. Its health indicators are like Europe in terms of female maternal mortality, infant mortality, and all of that. Okay? And they actually managed the pandemic also better because they put a much greater premium on health. Similarly, Tamil Nadu, it's another southern state, they have also spent a lot more on health, and they've improved their health indicators a lot. And they also managed it better. But we have the most populous states in the country, in the north and in the central part of the country, with very bad health indicators, very low health spending, and they were just devastated by the pandemic. It was a complete crisis.
I would want to believe that there's perhaps something inherently wrong with the Indian economy and the Indian government that puts it in a position where it's incapacitated to respond to any external shock, such that if we were to even subtract COVID from this matrix, we would actually see that the Indian government is incapacitated to respond to any other natural disaster or any other external shock that might devastate the economy. So what is it that is wrong, and what is it that's affecting the government and the economy in general in order to deliver and in order to be prepared to combat external shocks?
You know, I have to say you're right, but that is terrifying because we know that there will be many more such emergencies and many more such shocks, right? And yes, unfortunately, that's true. I think there are several weaknesses. One is, well, that part is similar, that many countries in the world have experienced several decades of neoliberal economic policies. And in many countries, that has meant a hollowing out of state infrastructure and so on. In the Indian case, it's meant that that hasn't even been built, that we don't have enough doctors and nurses per population or teachers per population. We haven't actually expanded those. Instead, it's been a privatized expansion, which means people who afford it, they can go to good hospitals and so on, and everybody else suffers, right? So we've had already a neoliberal strategy that has created significant inequality, not just in incomes and assets, but in access to health, in access to education, in access to security, to all of these things, okay? So that's one underlying problem. But in addition, we have had, since 2014, we've had a government that has been very polarizing. It operates on the basis of wanting to create a Hindu majority state, you know, which is against everything that India stood for since independence. India was all about plurality. It was all about tolerance and living together with difference. Because, you know, we have the most religions in the world, the most languages in the world, the most ethnicities in the world, everything. You know, we have a multiplicity of all kinds of things. And yet, the purpose of, you know, living together or recognizing difference and tolerating it and so on, that has been systematically undermined by the leadership today in India, which wants to create a Hindu majoritarian state. And that has all of the terrible aspects of polarizing that you can see in any other country that's trying to impose a religious minority state. So, you know, in fact, Hindus in India, such as they're called, they're only about 75% of the population. And we have the most Muslims in the world, for example. You know, we have, after Bangladesh, we have many, many Christians. We have all kinds of different religions, Buddhists and so on. Polarizing on the basis of religion is a very dangerous and damaging thing. And this is, number one, a polarizing state. Number two, it's a very centralized state. Increasingly, you know, decisions are made by the central government. And then the responsibility is left to the state governments. And that's very dangerous. You know, you can get even breakaways of states if that's the situation. Even within the central government, it's basically a few it's Mr. Modi and his close ally Amit Shah who call the shots. It's a very small group that controls even the central government. So even other ministers are not consulted about important decisions. We've had several episodes like that. We had a demonetization of the currency. 85% of the currency in circulation was declared invalid, again, 4 hours notice. He announces it at 8 p.m. and it begins at midnight. Other ministers didn't know. I mean, it's that kind of centralization. State governments didn't know, but other ministers in his cabinet didn't know. The central bank didn't know. So it's that kind of centralization, which is, again, not just damaging. I think it creates a very brittle polity that can break very easily, you know, chip at the edges. The third major failure, I think, is that part of, you know, being a very pluralistic society, polity, economy, is that there are checks and balances. Yeah, and also we had democratic institutions that provided checks and balances. Those have been systematically undermined. Our legislature has been really, it's become just, it's a rubber stamp vote for whatever the central, the people in charge decide. But the judiciary has failed us. The judiciary is not responding at all. They are frightened. They do what the government wants. The media has been suborned. There are very few independent news outlets left. And mostly they're struggling to survive. Their editors are jailed, the journalists are jailed, and they face all kinds of other cases and pressure and so on. Most of the mainstream media has gone completely with the government, especially the television media. And they also control social media. They have armies to operate on WhatsApp and Facebook and Twitter or X and all of those things. Okay? And then the independent agencies of the government, which are supposed to be autonomous, the investigative agencies, all of them have been taken over and more or less made to do what the government wants. So all the political opponents of the government are facing cases at every level: enforcement directorate, income tax, all kinds of other cases, in addition to criminal cases of the police variety.
Professor Jayati, thank you so much for making the time. Thank you very much for joining me here. I hope that you have a good day.
Thank you.